All right. So welcome to the final session of the 2025 Great Decisions program presented by the Indiana Council on World Affairs. Tonight's program is U.S. Global Leadership in a World Economy. And our speaker tonight is Professor Mike Hicks. And Mike is the George and Francis Ball Distinguished Professor of Economics and Director of the Center for Business and Economic Research at Ball State University. He previously served on the faculty of the Air Force Institute of Technology, Graduate School of Engineering and Management, and research centers at Marshall University and the University of Tennessee. Mike's research focuses on state and local public finance and the effect of public policy on location, composition, and size of economic activity. He has authored 3 books and more than 50 scholarly papers. Mike has received research and teaching awards from the University of Tennessee, Marshall University, the Air Force Institute of Technology, and Ball State. And his work has been highlighted in such outlets as the Rolling Stone, The Economist, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post. He has appeared nationally on C-SPAN, MSNBC, NPR's All Things Considered, and Fox Business News. And many of you may be familiar with his weekly column on economics and current events, which is syndicated in several outlets across the state of Indiana. Mike earned his doctoral and master's degrees in economics from the University of Tennessee and a bachelor's degree in economics from the Virginia Military Institute. He is a retired Army Reserve infantryman, having served in combat and peacekeeping operations in North Africa, Southwest Asia, Korea, and Japan. Mike, we're happy to have you with us tonight. Mike and I have kind of a personal relationship. Mike and I worked together at Ball State for a number of years, and Mike and I had some interesting conversations over the years on various topics. So I'm glad to have you here with us tonight, Mike. So with that, we'll give you some time here to kind of maybe reflect a little bit on the article in the Great Decisions book and some of your impressions on what's going on with the world economy today. So with that,
thanks, Ray. It's good to see you again, even though it's at a distance, and good to be with you all tonight. What I'd like to do is I'm tasked to talk about this piece by Dan Dresner, the evolution of U.S. leadership in the global economy, dilemma and choices. And I'm going to try to set it up by describing what it is, what I think he's talking about, and tell you where I agree with him, and walk you through some of the big observations that he's made that I think mean that he's right on the big issues. And I'm going to tell you where I disagree, and talk a little bit about what my 2 major disagreements are, and then finish up with what he thinks, and which I agree a great deal, are the 4 possible outcomes regarding U.S. leadership in the global economy in the coming years. And so I'll just say, I'm going to show you some graphs along the way. I'm an economist. I can't help but do that. So that's part of it. So I think Dan Dresner's thesis, and so those of you who don't know, he's a professor at Tufts, very well known, frequently on TV and elsewhere. His thesis that the 2016 election of Donald Trump marked a pretty clear pivot away from the post-World War II, what he calls neoliberal order, into something he calls now a post-liberal order. And he claims further that Joe Biden and the Biden administration continued this turn away from the neoliberal order, and that this most recent election, the re-election of Donald Trump, secures that change. And he argues that this moment, this post-2016, is what is known as a moment, a Kuhnian moment, in the sense that it marks a change in the order of the world. Now, Thomas Kuhn wrote a very important book to professors, particularly in business and sciences, called the name is slipping me, but it's the point that there's a change in scientific theory where the old theory is thrown out and a new theory is coming in, and that Kuhnian moment really marks a sharp departure. So if you think about the way the world thought about evolution before, before Darwin, there was a sharp change at that moment, or the way people think about DNA with Watson in the mid 50s, or those moments are full in scientific analysis and economic theory, that sort of thing. And he thinks this is that big an order of magnitude. And what he's talking about is he describes this neoliberal order is really this post World War II embrace of a rules based, which I call a classically liberal based view towards trade and alliances by the United States and most of our Western allies. And that time period was characterized as the United States and our allies making pretty tight economic and military alliances with those who most closely shared our values. So if you think about who this is, think about the tightness of the Five Eyes intelligence sharing agreement. The United States and four of our closest allies gather intelligence together. So there are American, Australian, Canadian, British, and New Zealand officers in almost every important intelligence gathering facility and processing facility around the world. So they're in DC, they're in almost every military base. They go to our schools to train. We go to their schools to train. We have rank insignia of the British Army that when you deploy, you carry that with, and they get rank insignia from the US Army. We share awards and decorations and training, and Americans command British ships, and British officers have been commanders of US forces. And so that relationship is very tight. Think about the economic part of it. Think about who is in the OECD countries where we've kicked Russia out. Who are the leaders of the World Trade Organization? Who are the signatories of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade? And those are all these Western countries that emerged from World War II, either aspiring to be affluent liberal democracies, or those that over that time became liberal democracies. And I'm going to argue that he has correctly identified what's happening now. I don't think he did. I don't think the causal mechanisms behind that rejection of the neoliberal order are probably as clear as he argues. And I'll show you some graphics of that in a few minutes. I also think he misuses Kuhn. And this isn't really science, it's a policy choice. And I think actually the revelations at the end, will show that it's not about the science, it's about bad policy. Before I do that, I just want to I'm going to quote like four of his key observations that are in, I think, page 3 or 4. And the first one is, he noted that in the 2017 inaugural address, President Trump declared, quote, "We must protect our borders from the ravages of other countries making our products, stealing our companies, and destroying our jobs. Protection will lead to great prosperity and strength." And as an economist, that's pretty hard to interpret. But it certainly reflects a rejection of the neoliberal order that trade is good, and that trade, generally is cooperative, and it's especially helpful between countries that aspire to affluence in the liberal order. In March 2018, which many of you will know is the month that he imposed tariffs, he tweeted out, when a country, parenthetically USA, is losing many billions of dollars on trade with virtually every country it does business with, trade wars are good and easy to win. And again, economists are going to have problems with that because here in the Midwest, we were clearly in recession by 2019. I think we were spared a national trade-related recession by COVID in 2020, which I'll show some pictures of some of these in a bit. And then his 2017, Mr. Donald Trump's national security strategy explicitly said the U.S. needs to rethink the policies of the past 2 decades. This is post-Cold War policies based on the assumption that engagement with rivals and their inclusion in international institutions and global commerce would turn them into benign actors and trustworthy partners. For the most part, this premise turned out to be false. And that's really targeting the failure of China when it entered the World Trade Organization to become a non-Marxist country. At least that's my interpretation of it, which is not terribly wrong. That doesn't mean that though those policies extended to nations that were already benign or positive actors should be effective. And then we think sort of about that's the Trump side, but the big interesting part of Dresner's thesis is that Joe Biden did much the same. And he quotes Robert Kuttner, who's the editor of the American Prospect, former founder of the Economic Policy Institute, sort of a progressive think tank. It's beyond center left, so it's not Brookings. It's something I've had some fights with over the years about their policies on domestic policy. And he quoted, he said, "We've just about won the battle of ideas. The core neoliberal claim that the economy would thrive if government just got out of the way has been demolished by the events of the past 3 decades." So this is like 2018. And sort of a rejection of that post-World War II order, and something that I think was embraced by the Biden administration. So my last quote here from Dresner: "Like Trump, Biden resisted adhering to WTO rules on procurement of goods and services and national security exemptions." That's the World Trade Organization. So he sort of blew off the free trade rules that were standard as part of the WTO. And like Trump, Biden erected measures designed to reduce economic interdependence with China. He actually continued his tariffs. And like Trump, Biden preferred industrial policies that would stimulate American domestic manufacturing. And that those sort of policies included things like the CHIPS Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, which was a heavy infrastructure and industrial policy act, and the infrastructure bill, which was very intensive on U.S. policies to support specific industries, farming and manufacturing primarily. And so, as we sort of wrap up what Dresner said, I think what he argues is, and I'm moving into my criticisms, that he likes to use what are primarily Western or Anglophile definitions of lower regulation and privatization of public services. And I'm not sure that really very well describes most of our relationships. Much of Eastern Europe, where we have been very close to, or NATO members, aren't really they're fine with heavy regulation and high level of public services owned by the public sector. The idea that the post-liberal order rejects free markets would be consistent with what many of our very close allies, including OECD countries, would have liked to have done before, and that would include protectionist policies, tariffs, quotas, and domestic industrial policies. And that's domestic industrial policies are really subsidies of what are viewed as key industries like semiconductor manufacturing or steel or automobiles. And I just want to say, I think he's right about the Trump-Biden departure from neoliberal policies. I think that in many ways, what Joe Biden was very placid in his rejection of anything but the Trump rhetoric. So he was very clear to say, we're back in the world, we're allies. And then within 6 months, he had done nothing on tariffs that had pushed much of the Midwest into a recession. We have not recovered manufacturing employment from where it was in the end of 2018, just a few months after the tariff. But he didn't, his rhetoric was there, but his policies were not. I also don't think it, again, the Kuhnian scientific revolution essentially says that when a predictive model stops working, it's rejected. And I don't think what's happened here is anything quite that thoughtful. I mean, he's talking about Donald Trump. He's not talking about a Nobel laureate doing research somewhere. So I think it's a stretch to make that claim. I like the example, but I don't think it stands to really good rigor. I also think his narrative of the path of the neoliberal world order from Bretton Woods in 1947 to for 2016 were right. I do think they were right. I just don't think he got the causal mechanism right. And he sort of attributes three things to the U.S. domestic rejection, both by the left, the Kuttners, the Robert Kuttner at the Economic Policy Institute, and by the populists that surrounded Donald Trump. And I'm just going to show you really quickly, if I may share my screen, some graphics on this. And so you all should now see this. And this first graphic is the U.S. manufacturing employment share from 1929, the first year that we have good national income account data, till now, till February of this year. And what I would like to point out, you can see in this graphic World War II, pretty straightforward, big spike in employment. Both the numerator went up and the denominator shrunk as we pulled 14 million people out of the workforce into manufacturing. If we were to look at constant employment numbers, that would be a flat line. And then if you look at the next 75 years, you'd be hard pressed to identify which of those years was post-NAFTA, that big sucking sound that those of us who are old enough to remember hearing in the election in 1992 from NAFTA. That's here and forward. It's kind of hard to find that. Or the China shock, which was really December 2001 to November 2008. That's when China was given permanent most favored nation status by the United States into the World Trading Organization through the collapse of the financial market in 2008. I'm having a hard time distinguishing that trend from any previous trends. And I'll just show you here. Here is the U.S. employment change since NAFTA. So since NAFTA, we've lost, yes, 4 million manufacturing jobs. And Ray and I talked a little bit about this before. The estimates of what caused these job losses are, we would have had a lot more jobs had we not got productive, but we were so productive, by my estimates, about 80% of the job losses. So that's, a little bit over 3 million of those jobs over that time period were due to the United States getting better at manufacturing. There are other estimates that say it's about 50-50. So 2 million, not 3 million or 3.2 million, as I think. About a third of those jobs potentially disappeared as a consequence of just renaming them. These are people who were in a manufacturing job and were outsourced to a manufacturing service job. The nurse was hired from an external company, same nurse, same security firm, same cleaning staff, and more of these were actually in technical. They went to professional services to provide robotic maintenance. And so that's a potential loss of some of these jobs. A very small number went to Mexico for the main reason that Mexico's manufacturing employment really hadn't changed since NAFTA. It's about the same as it was in 1994. China, for example, has lost factory jobs from about 2005. So if we look at employment since the China shock, that job loss that we see from, say, 2005 to 2008 could hardly have been China, because we weren't moving jobs to China because China didn't have more. So I think that argument about those jobs being a really major contributor to the losses of employment or this change in American policy are a bit more difficult. So I've stopped sharing that. That's kind of that point there. Just let me make a few other observations before I open it up to questions. Many of our international, and I'm moving a little bit from economics here. That last part was pure economics, into some observations. Many of our international alliances, particularly before the end of the Cold War, so from 1946 through 1990, 1991, we're not with very neoliberal nations, right? The Republic of Korea was, at least up until the 1980s, a shockingly unfree nation. We lost 56,000 men and women in the Republic of Vietnam, hardly a liberal democracy. Saudi Arabia, who I went to war and have a campaign medal for defending Saudi Arabia, is by no definition a neoliberal democracy. We were allied with Iran, which was more like a monarchy. So none of those nations shared shared almost any of our attachments to classical liberalism. And at the same time, in 1972, we ditched Taiwan for the People's Republic of China with very little fanfare or moral disruption. So I'm not sure even today our security arrangements, which are what Daniel Dresner is really talking about, including trade with those countries, ever look like a Washington consensus. They looked like a way to bolster our alliances against people who were, those countries were more afraid of countries that were different than us. And so we were allied with them for very transactional reasons at the time. Now, we did begin to drop some of those more unpleasant alliances after the Cold War, but we never really walked away from the governments that survived, right? So we're still, providing support for Kuwait and the Saudi Arabia. So I'm not sure that really was what we experienced. And so I agree with his timing, his observation. I think there's more to it, and therefore, because it's not ideological, it's not written in stone, the detachment from or from neoliberalism is probably not as permanent as you might think. And I think he would sort of agree with me if we were over a glass of scotch right now, because he gives three big predictions for outcomes here. The first one is what he calls a hypocritical post-neoliberalism. In that scenario, U.S. policymakers embrace the policies of post-neoliberalism, right? Or embrace the ideas of it. They talk about it, but they don't actually execute it. So the best, and that's exactly what 2018, 2019 turned in for Donald Trump. So he talked about tariffs, he imposed tariffs, he went to war of words with Mexico and Canada and backed away from them. That USMCA Act had no functional differences from NAFTA. He just wanted to claim credit for having done something important. And I think that's very likely that come next Wednesday, which is the day that the 25% tariffs are supposed to hit Canada and Mexico, that he will say they have finally done exactly what I said, which is what he's done twice already, because the economic consequences of it are likely so draconian that he's going to talk a big talk and then not actually execute. So I actually think that that's likely where we're going to go with that. And if you really listen to some of his more thoughtful, a Tom Cotton, for example, or Todd Young, these are thoughtful senators, leaders in our national security environment. They are very neoliberal in their viewpoint. They may give language that Mike Waltz, the national security advisor, is a neoliberal, cut his teeth on that view of the world. I don't think Pete Hegseth has an ideology, but that, it's very difficult to see us moving terribly away from that when even the national security leaders of the Republican Party are pretty much tied to this idea. His two other possibilities that we would actually see a failed new post-neoliberalism, and that here he thinks that the assumptions in this neoliberal policy prescriptions might be wrong. And so the things that economists have been saying really since Adam Smith through Larry Summers are wrong, that we might actually survive after the China and COVID shocks. Maybe we'll do just fine if the United States imposes tariffs everywhere, and that some of the places he sort of implies that some of the places that have had negative economic shocks over the past 3 decades because of globalization will come back. I think this is very unlikely. I don't think I know an economist who believes that we're going to see that come up, and I'm talking about economists, for my economists who are like Bernie Sanders friends, who think that his view on trade is stupid, but they like his redistributionist policy, all the way to my buddies who are actually wrote part of Project 2025, who know that the trade, the damage to trade from this are going to be, are not going to make anything better for the United States. And then, his last one is that there might be a paradigm shift where most every country, regardless of what the U.S. does, decide to stop doing trade, that they're going to worry about domestic work. And he actually uses a language here that causes an economist's hackles to rise, which is that China has now said they're going to grow more from domestic consumption and export promotion, and that actually just denies a fundamental understanding of what causes economic growth. So my conclusion here is I think Dame Dresner is really right that we're in this point where we don't know and should be very humble about what America's place in the world will look like in the future, and how much of the post-World War II American leadership and promotion of classical liberal ideas will survive. I think he is somewhat optimistic, which is most likely that we're going to have this wave of populism that isn't really implemented, and it's replaced by something more like the neoliberal order in the future. But he's also clearly concerned, as am I. And with that, I'll turn it over to Ray for questions.
Okay, thank you, Mike. That's I think a good reflection on the article that we had to look at here, and gives us some perspective on where we might be going. If any of you that have questions, please send them to me in the chat, and I'll call on you in the order that they're kind of presented. So the U.S. has been kind of the acknowledged world leader from an economic realm since World War II. What are some of the factors that have allowed us to kind of maintain that position as a global leader in economics?
Yeah, great question. We were not in the turn at 1900. We were a scientific backwater. I got a column coming out pointing out the first 2 decades of the Nobel Prize, we won 2 awards. In the last, so far this century, we've won 40. The short story is 2 things. Europe collapsed 1914 to 1918. It's difficult to overstate the consequences of World War I. Many of the countries that emerged from that had been somewhat liberal democracies turned to fascism very quickly. Italy, particularly Germany, and the United States was actually able to capitalize economically on the collapse of European economic activity. Talented people flooded here between 1900 1924 or so, which gave him, it's one of the reasons we've had the rise of the KKK and anti-immigrant feeling at that time. And the United States have been very accommodating of people who can make money, who can start businesses, who can do things. We've had a fairly low regulatory framework relative to other countries. We've had class structures, but we've also, at least we like to think, there's been a lot of movement back and forth in classes. I had one grandfather that had an eighth grade education. The other one did manage to go to high school. Neither of my wife's grandfathers finished more than 8th grade. And so, within 2 generations, you see really radical change that I think gave us an ascended place. All of that builds up to the story that this is the most productive country. When people look at the size of the economy, they say, are we stronger than China? Because our economies are reasonably the same size. But there are about 5 times as many people, 4 times as many people in China as there are in the United States. They work at much higher rates. They work much more each week. The standard of living in China is about a quarter of what ours is today. So even with our dysfunctional politics now, we're a free market that allows entrepreneurs to do things is really the difference between us and, say, Italy, and really the difference between us and China. So, I think there's very little evidence that China is converging with us economically, and certainly not in this century or the next. And that's our biggest rival. So, when it really comes down to it, it's having educated people, people who can move to places to make things and be productive, and then having very little government interference in trade are sort of the hallmarks of our success.
Okay. Well, that's interesting to think about it that way. And certainly this audience and most people we know have taken advantage of those educational opportunities and uh, so forth. So just kind of going back to the U.S. as a leader, the dollar is like the world reserve currency. For non-economists, what does that mean exactly? And is this really important? I mean, for us to maintain this notion of the U.S. reserve currency or reserve currency?
Right. So what people don't really understand is that our trade balance is dependent. We run a trade imbalance. So we sell less than we buy from other people. And the reason we can do that is because American institutions and the American economy, and particularly the American dollar, are viewed as sacrosanct, that they're not going to fail. The U.S. economy can go through downturns; it's going to recover, and that the U.S. dollar is the safest place to put your money. So our trade imbalance, which has been constant, almost constant for 75 years, which is we've been running a trade and negative trade balance for about 75 years, is really the measure of how much people are willing to let us buy in order to hold our currency. And so because we're a reserve currency, you take $100 bill and you can spend it almost anywhere in the world. In fact, if you want to go in Afghanistan, American soldier walking through to carrying money to bribe Afghan officials carried American cash, because American money is a lot more valuable in the Eastern Highlands in Afghanistan than anything else. So that ascendancy of our economy means that we are able to run a trade imbalance. In other words, people are willing to just accept terms of trade that allow us to consume more than we produce. And it's really important, I think, for that purpose. And it's not something we can affect directly. We can't engage in a direct set of policies that preserve that. It's really dependent upon whether or not we remain the strongest economy. We replaced Great Britain with that in the 1920s, 1930s, because our economy was much stronger and less damaged by the First World War than was theirs.
So do you think this BRIC movement to kind of replace the U.S. dollar has any legs?
No, I don't. At the end of the day, it's really about the microeconomic agents, the buyers and sellers everywhere, what they say. And so, India, for example, the largest of the BRIC countries, would like to see some other currency replace the dollar because we have a pretty stable currency and their currency is unstable. And so it might mask some of their currency instability if they were to go somewhere else. But they pushed really hard to change the dollar for oil, and that didn't go anywhere, mostly because nobody wants to trade oil and something different. So people are engaged in international exchange, whether it's wiring money home to your parents in Bangladesh, or if it's building a semiconductor factory, they want to do it in dollars.
Yeah. Larry Chimino had a comment. Larry?
Yeah, thanks. This is really interesting and really important. Today I was reading that there's a huge number of U.S. knowledge-based jobs that are going to India. It's kind of going under the radar. I think I want to get your thought about a couple of things. The movement of these knowledge-based jobs out of the country, and India is a great place for these, obviously, because they have a really large workforce. It's a skilled workforce. They work for a lot less money than our people do. And now another piece of information which just came across was that we're going to put a 25% tariff on all imported cars as we try to re-energize our manufacturing sector, which are not necessarily knowledge-based jobs, are we doing the wrong thing and pushing the knowledge-based jobs overseas, and in fact trying to bring, reestablish our manufacturing sector, which probably can't compete on an hour-for-hour basis with the places in the world where we're trying to bring them back from. Are we all turned upside down in what we're trying to do here, and with our economy and with our jobs and with the kind of jobs we want to promote for Americans?
Yeah, I think you've just articulated a strategy that's far more advanced than any of the thinking that has gone into current American industrial policy. So, yeah, we're seeing knowledge-based jobs go to India. We have seen them go to other places. Of course, London's cheaper than New York. Canada's less expensive. I'm more worried about knowledge-based jobs going there. There's sort of no limit to the number of knowledge-based jobs that can be created in the global economy. So I'm not at all worried that we might see many of these jobs go somewhere overseas. There'll be an equilibrating force. India will become more affluent, less attractive maybe for job flows because the wages will equilibrate. And so there will be some sectors that are just not going to, if you're doing hand coding or you're doing supply chain management, the math for it, maybe China or India is a good place to do it. But what that does is expose Americans to more valuable jobs here, and I think we'll be good with that. The bigger fear that I have, and I've got a column churning on it, is that American universities are really built on the failure of liberal democracy in Europe. So we were a backwater in 1900. I think the first PhD in economics was given in the United States in 1890 when Alfred Marsh had already written the textbook in Britain at the time. And really our success has come from immigrants, both first generation and multiple generations. And if you look at our just spike in Nobel Prizes, that's the powerhouse of American science. Across the country today, universities are struggling to hire those people. Here at Ball State, we tried to hire a young woman. We hired a young woman, 520 applicants for an assistant professor job. We got her. If the funding goes away, she'll just get a job in Toronto or Ontario, somewhere else. So I could see if I were a Canadian advisor, I'd say, for $1 billion a year, which is rounding error on their national budget, we could suck a generation of American talent out of the United States in 4 or 5 important scientific fields. And I think that those areas are far more easy to identify than where the location of commerce would be. And I know that Europe is doing that. When you get off this, Google, what are Canadian universities doing about the problems with Doge? And so you see that. In terms of the, bringing manufacturing jobs back, the president often makes the claim that this would happen if manufacturing jobs come to the United States as a consequence of the tariffs that he undertakes. It will be the first time in history, and economists have literally tens of dozens of natural experiments with tariffs that would have happened. So it's so heavily studied in economics that we don't really call it into doubt. And so, no, we're not going to be, we're competitive in manufacturing with really high skilled, highly trained manufacturers who are putting together stuff that arrives just in time from all over the world, that's assembled by people who are less skilled and less well paid. And we check it for defects and we put it together in something that's really valuable and we deliver it to the world from here. Bringing all of those things back to the United States is just going to raise the price of those, even in the input costs. Even if we bring those jobs back, it's going to be a lot more costly to assemble those cars and cell phones and other things that we make here, satellites and the like.
Thank you. Yeah. If I can follow up quickly, you mentioned the universities, and we train a lot of PhDs, and anyone that comes from overseas has to at least claim that they're going to go home. A lot of them don't want to go home, and we could probably benefit from them because as we train them and send them home, it seems like they're going to be in a position to run the kinds of operations you've just described. They'll have the knowledge, they'll have the knowledge base, and they can help their industries to assemble the complex pieces of complex equipment and compete with the United States. Of course, Canada, as you mentioned, is perfectly happy to first of all retain the PhDs that they train there, and I'm sure they're going to be accepting a lot of ours in the near future as we piss them off at the universities and uh, stop the funding that's going into research in the universities. I mean, I know that universities now are seeing programs being canceled. They're not bringing in new PhDs to run these programs and such. We're gonna really have a brain drain and brain atrophy here if we don't uh, keep some of these folks in the United States, I think.
No, you're absolutely right. I think that's the real negative shock we're going to face, that we're going to experience from a long time, far more than, because I think the tariffs will come, we're going to feel pain, they're going to be taken off. But, if you're I've had, I'll tell you two immigrant stories. One of the smartest grad students I ever had couldn't get a visa here because she married she's Ukrainian Russian. She married a Belarusian Russian in the United States. Once they did that, they wouldn't give either one of them permanent visas, despite a doctoral degree and a master's degree between them. They're now in Canada. She started her own business. She's worth several times what I'll ever be worth. She's probably 45 now. It's beautiful children. The second one is I paid for a student who came here to get his PhD. He stayed with me for 8 years, out published me like crazy, and then said, look, I've been here 8 years. There's company wants to hire me, a startup company wants to hire me as vice president, and they've offered me compensation that's more than you can offer me because it's more than you make. And so I wish him well, and he's doing really well. He's now wondering whether or not he should move his family back to two people eager to come to America, have a child born here, American citizen, very likely to consider leaving. He can do his work somewhere else where he's not worried about being scooped up on the streets because he matches somebody else's name who's a cartel member. So it's pretty stupid. If I were China, Doge would be the optimal thing I could do to the United States. Non-kinetic negative effect on the United States would be Doge.
No, you bring up a dirty word there, Doge. I don't know.
Mhm.
Well, anyhow, we got some questions coming in here. Denise Franklin, you out there?
Hello. Thank you for being with us tonight. I've really enjoyed what you've had to say. And go Vols. Got my master's there in 92, public administration. So yay. We, at the end of last year, we had a presentation on population growth and how that's going to impact global economies going forward. So in light of what the last couple of questions we're talking about, can you elaborate on the impact of baby boomers as they age out of the labor market?
So the youngest baby boomers have turned 60. I'm 62. My brother turned 61 in January. He was born in January 1964. So they've already all turned 60. That's the second largest generation in U.S. history. The largest generation are their kids. So we have a fiscal problem because those of us as baby boomers voted ourselves a lot more Social Security than we would pay into it. And we were lucky enough to really live a long time, knock on wood. And so that generation will put a fairly big fiscal bump on us. The good news is that our children outnumber us, and they're entering their prime years in the economy. So economic growth should be fairly robust because you tend to not be very productive when you're young. Then you tend to be very productive in your middle years, and then your productivity tags off. Our children of the baby boomer entering their generations entering their prime productivity years. So we could have a really big period of economic growth like we had in the 1980s and 1990s when we baby boomers entered our productive part of our generation. And I think there's some evidence that up until the most recent data, was going to be ugly next week for jobs, that we were in that. There was good productivity growth post-COVID for a lot of reasons. The bigger problem in the long term is that we have a fiscal environment that really takes care of older people through government action, and that taxing people to pay for that does slow economic activity, although its costs are way oversold by anti-tax folks. The evidence is not that it's huge. And so countries that are, tax themselves at 10% more than we do, almost, we're about 17.5% of GDP in federal tax dollars. Those that are like 30% are still doing reasonably well. The problem is that as good as our children were, they're not having nearly the number of kids that we have. So our growth rate has now dropped beneath replacement rate, which is about 2.1, 2.2%. So we're having about 0.8 kids per adult right now. And so U.S. population growth is sustained right now by international immigration. If you saw the data in Indiana, we had, we're a state of 6.5 million people. 70% of our population growth was immigrants. That was 40,000 people, and 4,000 in net immigrants, and 9,000 births over deaths. The births over deaths will end and will reverse statewide this year. And the challenge with that for places like Indiana and the country as a whole is that just limits the number of inputs to the economy, the number of working people who can do that. And what the real challenge of it is, if you're going to have slower population growth, you have to have a lot more productive people. And the only way to do that is to make sure that they're much healthier, much better educated, spend more time in school, study more things that offer more productivity, and then work longer, take fewer interruptions over their life, or when they take them, they're of shorter duration. And the challenge with that, what I just described there, looks like Denmark, right? A lot more years in school, paid for by public dollars, a lot longer work life, child care tax credits or child care support, free or nearly free universal health care. So the models that we look very different from the ascendant political dynamics that we have right now in the US. But that is our long-term fear. Just at the end of the day, it's okay if we grow slower, if our population is growing slower, as long as we don't have an enemy to fight. And I don't think we have and we're not going to engage in a land war with China. I think that's highly improbable. As a retired Army officer, I was a planner in Korea and in Japan. It just is so awful to consider. I don't think people are considering it seriously. And it's okay to grow slower if your economy is growing, if your population is growing slower. The big key is you want to have an economy that's the per capita growth is occurring at a much higher rate that allows us to pay for these, elder care and child care and things like that are going to be in part necessary to sustain a vibrant economy.
All right, that's just to kind of follow up on that. So you're talking about the United States. Africa is projected to be the one place in the world where population will continue to grow. What are the prospects? I'm maybe out of your wheelhouse here, but what are kind of Africa's prospects for economic growth over the next 10, 20 years?
I've actually been to Africa several times. My brother commanded U.S. Army, U.S. Special Operations in Africa, so I'm pretty familiar with it. There are substantial challenges in Africa, right? There have very little state capacity in most of Africa. Has very little state capacity. So a place like Kenya that we thought might be really good state capacity, or perhaps Egypt, have very little state capacity. And that's a way of saying that it's very difficult for them to capitalize on their growth prospects because they don't have the infrastructure to provide, K through 12 education. They don't have, much less higher education. They don't generally have stable economies that would invite a lot of investment. The wheel and spoke plans that China had in Africa failed abysmally because They were giving money to people with very little state capacity. There are some bright spots that are growing some state capacity, like Nigeria. They're still fighting a war with Islamic terrorists, and there are about a dozen countries in Africa that could be destabilized almost instantaneously from that: Somalia, Ethiopia, Sudan, Libya, Syria. So they're going to get population growth, of course. But I think the notion that they're going to have sort of productivity growth led by educational attainment and a more modern commerce is a far more dicey affair. I would also say that one of the challenges in a country like that, which we're seeing in Eastern Europe, is that their national borders were never really aligned with ethnic variability. And so where you see tensions like in the Balkans, I think 3 generations of my family have gone to war in and around the Balkans. Most recently, the United States was there in 98, 99. Is a problem across the country or across the continent. So, it would be very nice if we could get, Nigeria and Liberia and Kenya and South Africa to do really well, but there's no evidence that any of those countries are poised for anything other than population growth. I'm very skeptical that we have a way to fix that this century.
Yeah. Well, that's kind of interesting because as someone mentioned earlier, we had a speaker last year on demographics, and Africa was the one place in the world projected to actually have growth. Even India and China are, even though their population will grow, the replacement rates have fallen below 2.0 in all those places. So
yes,
yeah.
Well, and so for us, importing people from Africa voluntarily would be a very wise thing to do. So that's a source of immigration in the United States, and I'm sure that if I were to say that on Twitter, I would have some interesting responses. But that as Ray well knows, the students people coming from here anywhere to get higher education, we got to think about keeping in places that are growing fast. That's likely to be the case. So.
Yeah. All right, I think Claire Collins has a question that's going to change gears here a little bit.
My question concerns Bitcoin. And I believe it's El Salvador is a country that was going to go on the Bitcoin system. But most concerning is that a few weeks ago, Doge invaded the Social Security office, and they took our Social Security numbers, whether we're retired or working. That's a problem because I feel like they could invest in Bitcoin, and I don't think that's a good idea. And I'd like to hear what you have to say about Bitcoin and also the last week's stunt at Fort Knox. Are they going to take all the gold too?
They could have all the gold. I like gold. It really has only aesthetic value. It's not really a store of currency, so I'll just dispense with that. Yeah, they're really sort of cryptocurrency really comes in sort of three flavors. One of it supports criminal activity or quasi-criminal activity. So Bitcoin is really, I'd say the 3 total things. The first one was invented and really used for criminal activity. So if you want to pay somebody for child pornography or moving drugs, Bitcoin or Dogecoin could be a Bitcoin in particular is a really optimal currency for that. And I'm not suggesting anybody do that. I'm just telling you that's what it's good for, because it's not easily traceable by governments. And it's clean, and despite the tracking capacity, it really is primarily fuels a criminal enterprise. The second one is that allows a speculative sort of capacity. Dogecoin or Trump coin, what was it, $Trump that started, is a these are pump and dump schemes that you say, I'm introducing this new coin, I'm going to do it. If you get in early, you buy it. It gets pumped up, and it's a Ponzi scheme. And if you can actually sell it, you can make a lot of money. So there are plenty of people wandering around who made $30 million in Bitcoin or Dogecoin or something like that. But ultimately, these all collapse on their own accord because there's nothing backing in them. There's no government protecting them. There's no they're not generally used for transactions like Bitcoin. And then the third, and I think increasingly most common use, the ones that are surrounding governments, are for corruption. So if you're President Trump and you're going to announce a currency, you might say this is this new currency, and if you're the first person in, you can capitalize on most of the investment dollars that go into it. And so what we saw with that Trump Ponzi scheme is that all kinds of nefarious actors threw money into it because it's an easy gift to the early advocates, which of course are the Trump family and close acolytes. And so, El Salvador is marginally, legitimate state right now. I think we're paying people to export them extra legally there, and so their adoption of Bitcoin, I think, is sort of a joke. They've got transactional currency, and so I don't see any circumstance where a large country would engage in Bitcoin, or that a responsible investor would put anything like a little bit more than a little bit of money in Bitcoin. Does that mean that we won't get a Social Security Administration that tries to do that? Maybe, but right now they're not running any money to invest. So I'm not confident that I'm not very scared of it. What I think it is, Bitcoin's a good way to commit crimes. There's plenty of people who are speculating against other folks, and if you're in if you speculate in that area and you're losing your money, it's just like going to a casino, but maybe not as smart in that, because you're going to lose 100% of the time. And then the third part of this corrupting influence, and I'm of the view that if we get out of the current world or post-liberal order with just a lot of corruption, we'll be pretty lucky.
To follow up on that a little bit, I've heard some discussion about the United States establishing a sovereign wealth fund. Is that connected to this at all, or where is this money coming from that's going into this? Or is that something that
it's coming from your tax dollars, all the extra ones we get? Yeah, sovereign wealth fund. Many countries have them, are generally investment funds run by the nation. And the United States has resisted this for the fairly obvious reason that there's nothing more corrupting than the government lending money out of, we have them in cities all over the country. I've seen Muncie has a revolving loan fund, right? And so that's, I think anybody's taking money directly from it? No, but they're probably buying the right piece of property to get approval from the board, and they're going to donate to the Chamber of Commerce and do all these things. So that sovereign wealth fund, I think, would take act of Congress to establish. So we have a compliant Congress, anything's possible, but that would be a way of investing in businesses. So it is an extension of that post-liberal post-liberal economic order, that the U.S. government would say, gosh, I really want something to be built. I want Tesla to be built here, so I'm going to loan them money at low interest rate. But we're doing that. State governments are giving tax incentives and tax breaks, and all kinds of direct payments to companies that they favor. That's why that's the Tesla exists, because of tax breaks for electric vehicle producers. So we're doing that now, but we're not doing it through something as nakedly corrupting as a sovereign wealth fund.
Yeah. Well, my one experience with it is through Saudi Arabia. Of course, they're probably the worst case scenario for a sovereign wealth fund, and So I was just curious as to, where the money came from. Usually it's out of excess, and if we have a trade deficit or a deficit, a budget deficit, how we could be putting money into a sovereign wealth fund doesn't seem to make much sense.
No, well, but I will say the bill that Congress approved, or is proposing that's going to come up in July would be the most inflationary, big, huge budget deficits involved with it. So why not throw another 300 billion into a sovereign wealth fund if the currency is going to go through hyperinflation over a 3 to 5 year period. So it's really that worrisome. But you're right, Saudi Arabia uses it. I mean, the countries, Great Britain would sort of manage this. They did it differently. They had favored actors, the Hudson Bay Company, the East India Company, that were created with boards, members of parliament, and other affluent folks that sort of did the bidding of the country. A sovereign wealth fund would create a quasi-private quasi-government company that could do things in places. And again, it's if you're looking at Saudi Arabia for a model of corruption, that is, having spent my period of time dealing with Saudi Arabians, is that anything you wanted that was a non-standard required payoff. So it's exactly what we would be seeing, a big departure from our classically liberal view of the world post World War II.
All right, well, thank you. I think Betty Tonsing has a question.
I'm going to go back to what Larry had said about students who come to the States for their advanced degrees, or even principally PhDs. And we hear so often, I hear a lot in meetings over the years, it's a brain drain. We're letting these students go back. We got to figure out a way to keep them here. And I'm thinking, if you've not lived overseas, I lived overseas for 15 years, it's a brain drain for the countries if they don't get these valuable students back. And I love the way that Larry phrased it, because it gives a better argument the next time I hear that if they can go back to their countries with what they've learned here and advance their own country, the technology, manufacturing, whatever it is in, they become trading partners, much as the loss of our USAID. It was lifting the least of us, but it was also helping to create future trade partners. And so when you take a look at the continual things coming out of this administration that really harms return of an investment, and I'm wondering, along that line, with not advancing within our own country the opportunities for future whoever scientists, the technology, school after school is having to rescind offers made to students. My daughter's at NIH only because, as a scientist, because of getting one of those wonderful grants for the School of Medicine at IU, and then on to postdoc at University of Chicago. Has the administration not thought this through by these cuts, these indiscriminate cuts that were cutting our noses off competitively with the rest of the world? Because they will go to other countries with their skills and their talents, their abilities, and they will win. And how this is making America great. But Mike, maybe I'm asking a rhetorical question, but have they given no thought what this means by cutting these opportunities off? There's no way we can continue to advance without these investments, just in the education area alone.
I mean, I'm puzzled.
Yeah.
I'm deeply puzzled. I mean, there should be a few things that we agree on. We would like to see America, United States America, stronger, more affluent, more powerful around the world. That sort of, those sorts of things I thought were beyond debate at this point. Clearly, the policies that we're doing now would shrink us and pull us back. I mean, when I look at individuals who I think are pretty heavy spokesmen for the future of the populist movement that has swept across us, they're not. JD Vance is not at all interested in that stuff. And I mean, if you, I thought the exposure by the Atlantic and Jeffrey Greenberg's comments about the airstrike in Yemen, which I support, that's a right policy. been appropriate for the United States to maintain shipping lanes against our enemies for 250 years. It's an appropriate thing to do today. There were several things exposed on that release about the professionalism and the thoughtfulness of the men and women charged with defending our national interest. Among the things that are most interesting is that J.D. Vance and many of the other ones aren't being performative in their criticisms of Europe. I mean, when you make a speech before Britain or to the EU, and you're very interested in them increasing their defensive posture against Russia or taking over from the United States, which are not inconsistent policy goals to take over a larger share of that defense, you may say things there that are difficult for them to hear. We do that to allies. It's probably better to do it in private than public, but we do that. On that, on the comments made by J.D. Vance in that debate make it clear that it's not a false position that he's offering to try to do something. He literally doesn't think we have any sort of consistent ties with Europe. And I don't know what in his education would have suggested that's the case. I don't know what evidence there is that that's not an important for the United States. And so when you're trying to deliberate on these things, you must say, I'm going to take them at their words, that they don't want us to be stronger and more powerful. They want us to retreat from the world. And we think there's a future in that. I think that's just bizarre, but it is what it is.
Yeah. And it doesn't seem like there's any possibility that there are any ears listening to counter this.
No. Well, I mean, I don't think I don't think that the majority of educated Americans believe that retreating from global. I don't think the majority.
No, we don't. But I'm talking about is Trump and his people around him. Is there any way? Will anybody listen?
No, I don't think. I think they will listen to pain, and I think we're going to have to experience some pain for that to happen.
Yeah.
And that's unfortunately my argument for optimism is that the pain will be coming faster than many people had thought it would. And I'm very hopeful that we go ahead and oppose those tariffs next Wednesday, not because I want to see a sharp downturn in economic activity, but I would like to see a very clear experiment shown to the American people, which we did not get last time. The last time, I think by summer of 2020, I think Donald Trump's tariff policies would have damaged the United States economy enough that we would have been near recession. It would have been a near run thing for him anyway. The fact that we saw we had COVID interrupt that downturn, I think masked to many Americans who may have been paying attention the negative effects of those tariffs. So I think it would be better for us to go ahead and experience them this time in their fullest.
Right.
Let's at some point when a child touches a stove, you can only warn them so many times.
Right. Yeah. Yep. I've heard others say the same thing. Yep.
All right. Thank you, Betty. Larry, I think you had a follow-up question.
Well, I did. You mentioned something and made me think. How astounded I was to hear that President Trump wanted to rescind the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, saying that made us non-competitive. And it does in a way, I suppose. I've worked most of my career in international business and pharmaceutical industry, working throughout Africa and the Middle East primarily, and where we did have a competitive disadvantage, if you would. But there were ways to work in those countries and keep your integrity without being more corrupt than the other participants in those environments. Once you eliminate the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, or say it's okay to bribe anybody, because that's the way business gets done. Perhaps that's the way it is in the construction industry. But if you lose your credibility, that and things start not going to the best product or equal product at a better price, but going to the one who bribes the person the most. I had to clean up situations in Africa where things were going to the lowest bidder who, well, I don't know, they're the lowest bidder. They went to the bidder who bribed the Minister of Health the most, and countries ended up buying poisonous medicine, and people were dying from it. But the guy lined his pocket. we can't let our industries establish America around the world as somebody that's going to not have those kinds of principles and ethics that that we're going to stoop to to bribing people because other people do it. It's just not the way that I think we're going to establish the growth that we need with really good products to be able to capitalize on those markets. So, what's your thought about that? About moving away from the act that tells us we can't bribe people to get the business.
I think it's a huge mistake. I think we apply Occam's razor here. That's very well understood that by doing so, that facilitates corrupt practices. It's going to enrich primarily a few companies that were always willing to engage in it. And there may be, I think, flows of cash to some folks here. And so when somebody, stops the enforcement of a law, I can't undo it because Congress would never think to do that. I'm always reminding everybody, when you think everything is terrible, that President Trump has the control of the House and the Senate and appointed, or that Republican appointed 6 out of the 9 Supreme Court justices, and he's not taking anything to them. And the reason for that is he cannot he cannot repeal the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. He's not going to be able to get probably a budget passed. He's going to have problems with that. Those are guardrails of that were designed by founders. So he might not enforce it for a few years. The next president can retroactively enforce the hell out of it, and that ought to keep people concerned.
All right. Well, thank you. Hey, I have kind of maybe a technical question about central banks. We have the Federal Reserve Bank in the United States, whose job it is to kind of prevent us from falling into recession. Other countries have central banks that have the same responsibility. Do these central banks talk to each other? How do they coordinate? If one country is choosing to have low interest rates right next to a country that has high interest rates, there could be this, negative kind of spillover effect across countries. Do these central banks coordinate with each other, or how does this system work globally?
For all the large central banks, they have become like us. So Great Britain was the last holdout. The U.S. built this independent central bank in 1913, the Federal Reserve, and Britain still had their Treasury and central bank Chancellor of the Exchequer together until I think Margaret Thatcher managed to get that split. So these independent central banks work together. They share data and information. They don't have to coordinate very much, simply because if you look at our Federal Reserve, is very cautious about talking about the future in ways that are very clear to anybody who's listening. That's their goal. Other Federal Reserve, other equivalent central banks do identically. I just looked at the Federal Reserve Bank of Belize. They have a very clear pegging of the U.S. dollar, and they're only going to let it slip by 1% above or below, which is a very clear policy about what we're going to do with our money supply. So you don't have to coordinate very much. If there are differentials in interest rates because one country is lagging, which that certainly is the case, those the bigger concern they have is not capital flows, but exchange rates. And so if they drop rates too low, you could see exchange rates drop in a way that would merit like American imports or exports to the United States and hurt imports, which might cause their economy to expand. For the most part, I think in the developed part of the post-liberal order was to build independent central banks like the U.S. I don't see much retreat from that. And in part, 62 of the 92 Nobel Prizes in economics have been won by Americans. The prize was started in 1969. About half of those were immigrants to the United States. So it's not that we're particularly good economists. We just attract them here. So there is not really multiple economics around the world. There's not competing schools of thought like there might be in international science. Or I think Dan Dresner made his mistake is there are economists who disagree, but there's one science of economics. And there's not, so I will just say, I know Kevin Hassett, who's the head of the National Economic Council. He is not making an economic argument for tariffs because there is not one to make. So you can see an economic argument on, do we spend more on child health care? Do we spend more on child tax credits? Those are economic arguments that everybody might not agree on, but the, basic fundamentals of economics aren't much in disputation. And so, yeah, the Federal Reserve, all these reserves sort of coordinate, but it's implicit in the way they communicate with one another, or would just communicate publicly.
Yeah, so there's really no need for backroom cigar smoking discussion.
Yeah, I know they would get together to do that, right? They share economists, they talk all the time, I'm sure, but there's no need to, just because they publish everything they do. They're very transparent, everybody is. And so if you have 2 or 3 people looking at the central banks of each country and they're reading their stuff, and there are 650 economists or so at the Federal Reserve System around the country, and most of them are looking at macroeconomic issues and international trade issues, and the rest are looking at what's happening domestically. So I think they got a pretty good view of that.
Right. One thing that also has President Trump talks about is this balance of trade. Most, non-economists don't really understand balance of trade, balance of payments. Are these really important? I mean, are rich countries ever going to have a balance of trade that is equal? I mean, does that even make sense?
No, rich countries, so in fact, that would be a good segue to share another graphic that I have that will sort of put in context. Let me, if I can, share my screen real quick. And right, so what I have here, let me make it a little bit bigger so people can see. This graphic here is the next net exports as your share of gross domestic product in the United States. And that 0 line, anything below that means we've been running a trade imbalance. So what is that, 1991, a little bit of trade imbalance during a recession, positive a little bit then. Really, since World War II, we've been running a trade deficit. And if you look at this right-hand graphic, which shows the trade barriers, dutiable imports, and this is the effective tariff rate, we dropped it really quickly because we botched the Great Depression so badly. We exacerbated some, and Dan Dresner mentions that the Smoot-Hawley is responsible for somewhere between 2/3 and a half of all the job losses in the Great Depression. So if you just look over that time period in the United States, that is an unvarnished period of stunning economic growth, during which almost all that time we run a trade imbalance. So the way to think about a trade imbalance for an affluent country is quite simply that for us, the United States, we're trading with people and they want to invest in us because holding US dollars or holding US property is safe. And so they're investing in us. That means we can consume more. They're essentially lending money to US institutions that we can consume more than we produce. So that trade, so Americans have consumed more than we produced for about 75 years because we're the world's strongest economy. You want to go to a place that has a negative or positive balance of trade, it's like Nigeria, it's Botswana. Poor economies, underdeveloped economies run those big balances of trade because nobody's going to invest there. They have to sell stuff overseas, and that is really the way I like to think it is that the mercantilists, the Trumpians, they view the economy like a business. So that if you're selling more than you're buying, you're losing. So that's the way a casino is going to think about it. If I'm selling, if I'm buying more than I'm selling, I'm a loser. That's not the way economies work. Nobody models the economy like that. Really, Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, published in 1776, beat the hell out of that idea. They defeated that idea of mercantilism. so convincingly that within 2 or 3 decades, Britain was seriously reconsidering it. The way to think about economy as a family, we all have different strengths and weaknesses, and we're trading our services to one another based on our strengths or weaknesses, right? So my wife can reach the upper parts of the pantry. She has to drag a chair in from the dining room table to reach them, and I can just get them down for her. That's comparative advantage, right? She has a lot other comparative advantages. So mutual trade makes us all better off. And so by ending trade, now I've got to figure out how to make a casserole that I've never made, and she's got to drag the chair to the dining room or to the pantry. And that's the problem with the way we view trade, is that if you listen to Donald Trump, or you listen to somebody like Kevin Hassett at the National Economic Council, he sounds like he's saying something profound, but he's saying something that was intellectually defeated the year the United States was founded. And I think that's really gives us a sense of how profound the thinking is into our international affairs today.
All right, well, thank you. So one last question, and I know this might be a question near and dear to your heart. How is the global economy intertwined with national security? It would seem that if we're trading with people, we're not going to fight with them. So what is, how do we, advance this notion that trade and intertwined economies are really a good thing?
Yeah, so I'll just preface this by saying I have 2 children who are officers in ground combat units now, so I'm very concerned with the state of the world. So as you point out, is right, very few strong trading partners have ever engaged in war. In fact, that was the shock of World War I. It's very difficult to find another period of international conflict where trading partners fought. Most of the fights were about trade, trying to capture trade from one another. So certainly Napoleon and the 30 Years' War and the 7 Years' War were about ensuring trade, not stopping it. So trade is the opposite of war. A lot of people think peace is the opposite of war. That's not true. You can be peaceful with somebody you don't engage with. It doesn't demand anything of you. You simply don't fight them, right? So we're peaceful with like Belize, but there's no strong, links with Belize necessarily, or French Guiana. The challenge of the trade really means you must be cooperative. Trade is a cooperative human activity. It's our oldest cooperative human activity. And so that if you trade, you dampen the risks of conflict by creating both personal and then political ties, small p political ties across countries. I don't want to go to war with this country because I'm trading with them and I'll lose my fortune. I have businesses there that I own that will be, captured. And so that's really the cheapest way and most effective way to prevent war is to trade. So when we withdraw from that process, we move closer to conflict, not farther away from it. And there are some examples where you may wish to embargo a certain country to keep them from having the material of war. We did that with Japan in 1939. It didn't work out all that great for us.
All right. Well, Mike, thank you so much. It's 8:30 here, and I think we're ready to kind of sign off for the evening. But I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with us tonight. You've raised some interesting points and insights into how the world economy works. I really appreciate that. And I'll turn it over to Betty for some final thoughts.
Yeah, I would agree. I think, Mike, you also explained this in a way which was very understandable to us consumers. And I'm seeing a shake of heads. This is I don't understand how an economic think, but it's something that has to be explained to us so we understand it. So thank you very much. You did a great job of that. You really did. Thank you.
Thank you. It was good to be with you.
Yeah, well, it was wonderful having you. When Ray had suggested we have you as speaker, we were really challenged for this section because once again, we get the topics beforehand, and we were flummoxed this year with our list of topics because we get them, we try to get them filled well before the end of the year with the program you started in February, but not knowing the outcome of the election and then knowing the outcome of the election, but not the outcome of the inauguration. What are we really looking at with the list of topics and the economics? Where there was no way that we could have predicted that the issue just with the tariffs alone, that this would be happening to our good neighbors, for example, our number one and number two trading partners. That we would just slap them back like we have. So you have done a fantastic job of making it really clear and understandable. And this is it. This is the end of a wonderful 2024 program year for great decisions. It's every year for the committee. It's always a scramble. I want to say thank you again to my committee, which is wonderful. I know that Diane Farrell is on with us tonight. If Diane would just say hi. She has been on the committee. Claire used to be on our committee, and I tried to talk her to coming back. But and Dan Foote, he was on earlier. He is on our committee. And Sue Tempero. Sue, could you turn your camera on so that we can see you also and acknowledge? She may not be right at her desk right now, but she is also. And what I mean by committee is that everybody is responsible for finding the speakers. It's a shared work. And it's a lot of work, finding the right speakers that we think are going to bring the message home really well for you, and to do all of what's involved in with the background of the speaker, the marketing there. Sue, thank you, Sue, for your input this year. We're grateful, and my task every year as the chair is to convince people to stay on the committee for the next year, because this work cannot be done by one person. So thank you again, folks. This is the end of the Great Decisions Program year, but not for ICWA. Please, if you are can I see a show of hands of you in the Indy area? Okay, please let us see you in April and in May. It would be so important. It's going to be, the events are going to be absolutely wonderful. Again, with the Global Cuisine Cash Bar, wonderful networking with us, which would be so much fun, and then powerful programs. 2 very powerful programs. Mike, are you up there in Ball State land?
Yes, I'm in Baltimore. I'm on my office on campus right now.
Well, I mean, you're just up the road on 69. So why don't you come down and join us that evening? We are going to be.
I might.
Can you? Oh, please consider that. It would be great. It would also be great to meet you. I think a lot of people would like to meet you. They also are very familiar with your column. It's in the Indy Star, right? Indianapolis Business Journal.
It's in the Indy Star now and several other papers right now.
That's right, several national newspapers. So I think people would like to meet you and have a great conversation. And so we look forward to seeing you in April at the Indy Global Village, and also in May. So thank you once again.